Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
A few years ago, my friend Kayla and I decided to attend a classical music concert at an old, historic concert hall in our city. It wasn't a grand event or anything, just a local symphony performing lesser known pieces. The concert hall itself was charming but a little eerie, tall ceilings, dim lighting, and heavy wooden doors that creaked when you opened them. We got there early to grab good seats, and as we settled in, I noticed something unusual. Across the aisle and a few rows down, a man sat alone. He was wearing a dark suit that looked almost vintage, with a crisp white shirt and a tie that seemed just slightly off kilter, like it wasn't tied quite right. He sat ramrod straight, staring at the stage even though there was nothing happening yet. It wasn't that he was doing anything outwardly creepy, but there was something off about it. His stillness was unnerving, and the way he didn't even glance at the people around him or fidget like everyone else made him seem like he didn't quite belong. I figured he was just an eccentric music lover and let it go. The concert began, and for the first half of the program, I forgot about him entirely. The music was beautiful, and Kayla and I were completely absorbed. During intermission, we went to the lobby to stretch our legs and grab a drink. When we returned to our seats, I noticed that the man was no longer in his. The second half of the concert started, and that's when things got weird. About 10 minutes into the performance, I got this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't ignore the sensation. It was like a weight pressing on the back of my neck. I glanced over at Kayla to see if she was feeling the same, but she was engrossed in the music. Then I looked around the audience, trying to spot the source of my discomfort, and froze. The man in the suit was now seated directly behind us in the otherwise empty row. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't even noticed him re-enter the hall. My stomach churned, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he just wanted a better view of the stage. For the rest of the concert, I couldn't focus. I was hyper aware of every sound, every shift in his seat, every breath he took. At one point, I swear I felt him lean forward, just slightly, like he was trying to get closer to us. I gripped Kayla's arm as subtly as I could and whispered, "Don't look," but the guy behind us moved seats. Kayla furrowed her brow and whispered back, "What guy?" That's when my heart dropped. She hadn't noticed him at all. When the concert ended, we stayed in our seats to let the crowd thin out. I didn't want to risk bumping into him in the aisle, but when I finally glanced behind us, he was gone. No coat, no program, no sign he'd ever been there. I tried to laugh it off on the way home, convincing myself that maybe he'd just slipped out early. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of his unwavering stare and silent movements kept replaying in my mind. A few days later, I was scrolling through local forums when I stumbled upon a post about the concert hall. It was filled with stories of strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, cold drafts in the middle of summer, and a man in a dark suit who always seemed to be watching. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. My chest tightened as I scrolled through comment after comment about the man in the suit. The descriptions were eerily similar to what I'd experienced: vintage attire, an unnatural stillness, and, most unsettlingly, the way he seemed to appear and disappear without a trace. One commenter shared a chilling detail. They claimed the man was often spotted sitting in random places throughout the hall, but when approached, he would vanish. Another mentioned hearing whispers and feeling a sudden chill whenever they were seated near him. One post stood out to me. The user had uploaded an old black and white photo of a symphony audience from the 1920s, taken in the very same concert hall. My stomach flipped when I spotted him, seated near the back of the crowd, in a suit identical to the one I'd seen. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was him. The comments below the photo speculated that he might have been a musician, a patron, or even someone who died in the hall long ago. I slammed my laptop shut, feeling a rush of cold air, even though my apartment was warm. I wanted to tell Kayla about what I'd found, but I couldn't bring myself to call her. What would I even say? Hey, remember that guy we saw? Turns out he's probably a ghost. For weeks after that, I avoided the concert hall. I didn't even want to walk past it in case I caught sight of him through one of the tall, arched windows. Kayla teased me about how spooked I was, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. She even joked about going back to see if we could meet him again. No thanks, I said flatly. Once was enough. Months later, Kayla texted me out of the blue. She'd gone back to the concert hall with her boyfriend for another performance. Her message was short, but it made my blood run cold. He was there again. Same suit, same stare. This time, he was sitting next to me. I don't think I'll ever go back. I haven't set foot in that concert hall since. I don't know who or what that man is, but I do know one thing. If you ever find yourself at the old concert hall and spot a man in a vintage suit sitting silently, don't stick around. After Kayla's text, I spent the rest of the day in a fog of unease. I wanted to call her to get every detail of what had happened, but something stopped me. Part of me didn't want to hear it. What if hearing her story made it all feel too real? That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining the man in the suit, his still stillness, his unblinking stare, and the way he could suddenly appear where you least expected him. It was as if my mind was trying to piece together his presence to make sense of something that wasn't supposed to exist. A few days later, Kayla finally called me. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she was trying to keep calm, but I could hear the fear underneath. "I didn't want to text you everything," she started, because honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I listened in silence as she recounted her experience. She and her boyfriend, Matt, had arrived at the concert hall just as the doors opened. They found their seats near the middle of the hall, nothing unusual so far. But as soon as the lights dimmed and the orchestra began tuning, she felt it, that same heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. I turned around, and he was there, she said, sitting 3 rows behind us, staring at me. He wasn't looking at the stage, not at anyone else, just me. Her boyfriend hadn't noticed anything, brushing it off as her imagination. But Kayla couldn't shake the feeling. Throughout the first half of the concert, she kept sneaking glances behind her, and every time, he was in the exact same position. His eyes locked on her. At intermission, they went to the lobby. Kayla told Matt about the man, but when they looked back toward their seats, the man was gone. "We thought maybe he left," she said, "but when we got back to our seats, he was there, sitting next to mine. I felt a chill run down my spine." "What did Matt say?" "He didn't see it," Kayla whispered. "The guy was sitting right there, but when I pointed him out, Matt looked at me like I was crazy. He said no one was sitting next to us." She tried to ignore it, focusing on the music instead, but the presence next to her was overwhelming. She could feel the man's gaze on her, though she didn't dare turn to look. It wasn't until the end of the concert, when the crowd rose to applaud, that she finally turned to face him and found the seat empty. "I don't know what he wants, but it feels personal," she said, her voice trembling. "It felt like he was trying to make sure I saw him." And all the way, her words stuck with me. I couldn't help but wonder why Kayla. Why us? Was it because we'd noticed him before, or was it something deeper? I started digging into the concert hall's history, desperate for answers. What I found made my skin crawl. The man in the suit wasn't just a random spirit. There were scattered accounts dating back decades, all describing encounters with a figure just like him. But the most unsettling detail, in nearly every story, the man wasn't just watching, he was waiting. Some claimed he only appeared to those who were alone. Others said he targeted people who noticed him in previous visits, almost as if he was drawn to their attention. And in a handful of cases, people reported seeing him in other places, far from the concert hall, as if he'd followed them. Kayla and I agreed to avoid the concert hall for good. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the faces in a crowd, half expecting to see him again. This happened a few years ago, back when I was still working odd jobs while finishing school. One of those gigs was at an old electronics repair shop. It was one of those places that seemed like it belonged to another era, filled with shelves of dusty, obsolete gadgets and stacks of manuals with crumbly pages. The owner, Mr. Elwood, was a quiet but kind older man who had run the place for decades. He could fix almost anything, but his specialty was antique radios. One day, a man came in with an old tabletop radio. It looked like it was from the 1930s, wooden casing, fabric grille, the works. The man didn't say much. He placed the radio on the counter, slid a scrap of paper with his contact info across to me, and simply said, "It doesn't work. Can you fix it?" Mr. Elwood was thrilled to take on the project. He loved these old radios and said this model, in particular, was rare. As he worked on it over the next week, I noticed something unusual. Normally, he'd hum or talk to himself while working, but with this radio, he was silent. Sometimes, I'd glance over and see him just staring at it, his brow furrowed. Finally, he got it working, but when he turned it on, instead of the usual static or music from whatever station it could still pick up, there was just whispering, quiet, incomprehensible, but constant. Mr. Elwood adjusted the dials, but no matter what frequency he tuned to, the whispering remained. Weird interference, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. He powered it off, saying he'd run a few more tests the next day. That night, I was closing up the shop. Mr. Elwood had left early, so I was alone. As I was locking the front door, I heard the radio turn on in the back room. My stomach dropped. I was sure I turned it off. Cautiously, I walked to the back. The radio was glowing faintly, its dials turning on their own. The whispering was louder now. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frantic, like someone trying to warn me about something. Then, just as I reached for the plug to disconnect it, the whispering stopped. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the radio. And then, clear as day, a woman's voice came through. "Don't let him take it back." I froze. My first thought was to call Mr. Elwood, but when I looked at the clock, I realized it was after midnight. The man who who brought the radio hadn't been back yet, and I had no idea when he would return. I left the shop quickly, locking the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched as I walked to my car. The next day, when I told Mr. Elwood what happened, he just stared at me. "It's probably an old recording or signal bleed," he said, but his voice wavered. He packed the radio up and put it on a high shelf in the back, saying he wasn't comfortable returning it to the customer until he figured out what was going on. A week passed, then two. The man who dropped off the radio never came back. His phone number was disconnected, and the address he gave didn't exist. Mr. Elwood decided to keep the radio locked in the storeroom until we could figure out what to do with it. One evening, months later, I was passing by the shop after hours and noticed the lights were on. Thinking Mr. Elwood had forgotten to turn them off, I decided to pop in and check. But when I got to the door, I saw someone inside, a man in a dark coat, standing at the counter with the radio in his hands. I watched as he turned and walked toward the back door of the shop. I called out, but he didn't stop or even look my way. By the time I got inside, he was gone, and so was the radio. Mr. Elwood retired not long after that, and the shop closed. I still think about that radio sometimes, especially on quiet nights when I hear fate whispering that I can't quite explain. I tried to forget about the radio and the man, but it was like a splinter lodged in my mind. Every so often, I'd hear static on the radio at home or while driving, and for a fleeting moment, I'd think I caught a whisper just barely audible before fading into silence. A year after the shop closed, I moved to a new city for a fresh start. Things were peaceful for a while, but one night, I was walking home from a late shift when I felt that old, familiar unease creep in. The streets were quiet, too quiet, and every sound seemed amplified. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, and I swore I could hear someone else walking, their steps faint and out of sync with mine. I sped up, my heart racing, and when I turned the corner onto my street, I froze. Sitting on the curb outside my apartment was a radio. Not just any radio, it was the radio. I blinked, convinced I was imagining it, but there it was. The wooden casing, the fabric grille, the worn dials. The air around it felt heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? Instead, I walked past it quickly, eyes fixed on my door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint whispers, even though I'd turned off every electronic device in my apartment. I told myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, the radio was gone. There wasn't a trace of it, no scuff marks, no sign it had ever been there. I tried to convince myself it was over, but a few weeks later, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't faint. They were clear. The voice of the woman came again, repeating the same phrase, "Don't let him take it back." Only now, she added something new, "It's too late." From that moment on, strange things started happening. Lights flickered in my apartment even though the wiring was fine. Objects moved to places I hadn't left them. My phone played bursts of static during calls, no matter where I was. And then, the dreams began. In the dreams, I was in the shop again, alone. The radio sat on the counter, glowing faintly. The dials spun wildly, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were deafening. A shadowed figure stood in the corner, watching me. Every time, just as I turned to confront it, I'd wake up, drenched in sweat. I became obsessed with finding answers. I searched for records of the man who had brought the radio in, but there was nothing. No one had ever heard of it. I reached out to Mr. Elwood, but he was evasive, refusing to talk about it. The last thing he said to me before hanging up was, "Don't go looking for it. Just let it be." But I couldn't let it be. A few weeks ago, I got an unmarked package in the mail. Inside was an old photograph of the radio, taken in what looked like a basement. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "It listens. It learns. Don't turn it on." I've kept the photo locked away, but the whispers haven't stopped. They're louder now, and they don't just come at night. I hear them at work, in my car, even in crowded places. And I've started seeing the shadowed figure from my dreams, always just out of the corner of my eye, disappearing when I turn. I don't know what the radio wanted, or why it chose me, but if you ever come across an old tabletop radio at a thrift store, an estate sale, or even on the side of the road, please, for your own sake, leave it alone. A few nights after I received the photograph, I woke up to a strange sound in my apartment, a faint hum, like the low vibration of an old radio. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and scanned the room. Everything was still and silent, but as soon as I lay back down, the hum started again, growing louder this time. I got up, grabbed my phone for light, and walked toward the living room. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed something on my coffee table, the radio. It was impossibly there. The same wooden casing, the same fabric grille, and the dials that glinted faintly in the moonlight filtering through the window. I felt frozen, torn between the instinct to run and the irrational need to destroy it. But then the dials began to move. They spun slowly at first, then faster as if searching for a station. The hum grew louder, morphing into static, and then the whispers began again. This time, I could make out fragments of sentences. "He's watching. ... Don't let it hear you. ... You can't stop it now." The woman's voice cut cut through the chaos, sharp and desperate. You need to leave. It's not safe. And then everything stopped. The hum, the whispers, the spinning dials, it all went silent. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the radio until a loud knock at the door shattered the quiet. I jumped, heart racing, and turned toward the door. It was almost 3 a.m. Who would be here at this hour? Another knock came, louder this time. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced down to see an unknown number calling. Against my better judgment, I answered. Don't open the door, a voice said. It was the woman. The line went dead. I backed away from the door as the knocking grew more insistent, almost frantic. The radio suddenly came to life again, static filling the room. The whispers were louder this time, overlapping voices in a cacophony of warnings and pleas. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the radio and threw it against the wall. It shattered, pieces of wood and circuitry scattering across the floor. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling with adrenaline. But as I sat there, staring at the broken pieces of the radio, I realized the whispers hadn't stopped completely. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were still there, coming from inside the apartment. I turned slowly and my heart dropped. The shadowed figure from my dreams was standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, but I felt its presence pressing down on me, suffocating and cold. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning and I was lying on the floor. The radio was gone and there was no sign of the figure, but the whispers were still there, faint but persistent, following me wherever I went. I've since moved to a new city, changed my name, and cut ties with anyone who might still be connected to that shop. But no matter where I go, I can't escape it. The whispers are always there, growing louder at night, and I still see that shadowed figure in my dreams, or sometimes just out of the corner of my eye. I worked at a corporate office in a major city. Our building had one of those open plazas with fountains and planters, a place where office workers could eat lunch. Underneath the plaza, connected by an unassuming stairwell, was a parking garage that spanned several buildings. I always parked on the lower levels because they were less crowded, even if they were a bit creepy. It was dimly lit, smelled faintly of oil and mildew, and had those long, echoey rows of parking spaces where your footsteps always sound too loud. One evening, I was working late and didn't leave the office until almost 10 p.m. by then. The plaza was deserted, and the garage was eerily quiet. As I made my way to my car, I noticed something odd, a faint sound like humming. It wasn't the typical mechanical hum of the garage lights or ventilation. It was melodic, human, and at first, I thought it was just a trick of the acoustics, but as I got closer to my car, the humming grew louder. It was coming from somewhere nearby. I stopped and looked around, my pulse quickening. There were no other cars on my level, no reason for anyone else to be down there. The sound seemed to drift, bouncing off the concrete walls. I couldn't tell if it was in front of me, behind me, or coming from some far off corner. Hello, I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. My voice echoed back at me, but the humming stopped. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, straining to hear anything. Then, just as I convinced myself it was nothing, the humming started again, closer this time. I bolted from my car. As I unlocked it, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A figure emerged from behind a pillar about 50 feet away. They were wearing what looked like an oversized coat, the kind you'd see on someone trying to stay warm in freezing weather, but it wasn't cold that night. I didn't wait to get a better look. I dove into my car, slammed the door, and locked it. When I turned the ignition, my headlights lit up the figure. It was a man, his face shadowed by a hood. He wasn't walking toward me, though. He was just standing there, swaying slightly, staring in my direction. I reversed so fast I nearly hit a pillar, then sped out of the garage without looking back. The next day, I reported it to security, but they brushed it off. Probably a homeless person looking for shelter, they said, but it didn't sit right with me. There was something about the way he stood, the strange humming. It didn't feel random. I stopped parking on the lower levels after that and started taking the elevator to my car with other coworkers whenever possible. I never saw the man again, and part of me wonders if he was even real. For weeks after the encounter, I couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't just the man's appearance that haunted me, it was the humming. The melody had stuck in my head, replaying at odd times, like my brain couldn't let it go. It wasn't a tune I recognized, and it didn't have a rhythm that felt natural. It was too fragmented, almost like someone trying to remember a song they'd only half heard before. My coworkers teased me about how jumpy I'd become. I laughed it off, but inside, I felt like something had shifted. I started to notice little things, like how the parking garage always seemed colder than it should be, or how I occasionally heard faint sounds, footsteps or scraping, when I knew no one else was around. One night, I was working late again. Despite my precautions, I was the last one in the office. My car was now parked on the main level of the garage, much closer to the exit. I told myself it was fine. I'd been overly paranoid before. As I walked toward my car, the silence felt oppressive. My footsteps echoed too loudly, the kind of sound that seemed to fill up the space entirely. I didn't hear hubby this time, but I felt something, a shift in the air, like I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, reaching my car at what felt like record time. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. That's when I saw it. On my windshield was a smudge, faint but deliberate. It wasn't dirt or a random streak. It was a symbol, something that looked like a circle with 3 intersecting lines. I froze, staring at it. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone near my car. The garage had cameras, but they didn't cover every angle. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and drove straight home. When I got there, I scrubbed the windshield clean and told myself it was nothing, probably just some bored kid or an overactive imagination. But then it happened again. A week later, the same smudge appeared on my windshield, this time when my car was parked in broad daylight near a cafe I frequented. It was identical to the first, the same crude symbol. I started carrying pepper spray. I stopped working late and made sure to always leave with a group of coworkers. But the strangest thing was the humming. Even at home, I started hearing it, not often, but enough to notice. Sometimes it came late at night, just outside my window. Other times it seemed to drift through the vents in my apartment building. My friends assured me it was just coincidence, that I was imagining connections where there were none. Then, one night, I woke up to a sound. The humming was inside my apartment. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone had broken in. They stayed on the line with me until officers arrived. When they searched the apartment, they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. I felt like I was losing my mind. The police left, assuring me they'd patrol the area more often. But as I locked the door behind them, I saw it. On the inside of my living room window, drawn in condensation, was the same symbol. Seeing the symbol on my living room window sent a cold shock through me. I stood there, frozen, my breath fogging up the glass further. It was unmistakable, the circle with 3 intersecting lines. But how had it gotten there? The police had just been through my apartment. I hadn't left the window open, and the lock was secure. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise in the building made me jump, and I kept my pepper spray clutched in my hand until the sun finally rose. The next day, I called in sick to work and installed security cameras inside my apartment. I bought new locks and even considered breaking my lease to move, but I felt trapped. Wherever I went, the symbol and the humming seemed to follow. For a while, things were quiet. Weeks passed without any strange incidents, and I began to convince myself it had been an elaborate prank or some bizarre coincidence. I even started sleeping better, but then, one evening, I came home to find the humming again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from my bedroom. My stomach dropped. The cameras. I pulled out my phone and checked the footage. At first, everything looked normal. Hours of footage showing an empty apartment. But then, at around 2 a.m. the previous night, the camera in my bedroom captured something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed me sleeping, tossing and turning under the covers. And then, from the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to shift. A figure slowly emerged into the frame, moving unnaturally like a marionette being guided by invisible strings. It was the same oversized coat, the hood obscuring their face. They stood there, motionless, watching me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The video showed the figure standing there for nearly an hour, never moving closer, never making a sound, before retreating back into the shadows. I couldn't explain how they had gotten in or how they had left. Every door and window had been locked. I called the police again, shaking as I replayed the footage for them. They took it seriously this time, but their investigation led nowhere. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. That was the last straw. I packed up and moved out of that apartment within a week, breaking my lease and paying the penalty. I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere else. It's been a couple of years since then, and I haven't seen the symbol or heard the humming again. I've moved cities, changed jobs, and done everything I can to leave that experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear it, faint and distant, as if carried on the wind. A low, melodic hum that sends chills down my spine. I work as an assistant to a small-town real estate agent. Part of my job includes putting together open house packets and mailing marketing materials. One morning, while sorting through the incoming mail, I noticed a peculiar envelope. It was bright pink, the kind you might use for a Valentine's card, with no return address. The strange part, my name was written on it, not my boss's, not the office's, but mine, in looping, almost childlike handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly into quarters. On it were just 5 words, scrawled in the same odd handwriting: "Stop looking for the house." I laughed laughed it off at first, thinking it was some kind of prank. Maybe one of my friends was trying to mess with me. I even texted my group chat, but no one admitted to it. Weird, I thought, and tossed the note in the trash. The next week, I received another pink envelope. This time, it was slipped under the office door. It had no postage, so someone must have delivered it by hand. Inside was another note. I read it. Step. Now I was unnerved. I hadn't been working on any particularly unusual listings. My boss specialized in suburban homes and the occasional fixer-upper, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I brought the notes to her, hoping she might have some insight. She shrugged them off as a weird coincidence. Maybe a disgruntled neighbor, she suggested. Then came the third envelope. This one appeared on my car windshield while I was grocery shopping. I don't know how they knew which car was mine. My heart sank when I opened it. You're not listening. Go away. I started to feel paranoid. I hadn't been working on any active searches for homes, just some standard listings. But I couldn't ignore the coincidence anymore. I asked my boss if she had upset anyone recently. She swore she hadn't. That night, I decided to dig through my files to see if I could spot a connection, maybe an address or a property that might have triggered this bizarre harassment. That's when I found it, a listing from 6 months earlier. It was a foreclosed property we had briefly considered but didn't take on. It was an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, abandoned and falling apart. I remembered my boss mentioning that the property gave her bad vibes, which was unusual for her. She told me to archive it and forget about it. The next morning, I got another note. This time it was taped to my apartment door. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. Stay away from the farmhouse. I called the police, but without any evidence of a crime or a clear suspect, they couldn't do much. My boss finally agreed to delete the farmhouse from our system entirely, though it hadn't been active for months. The note stopped after that, but I still wonder who or what was so desperate to keep us away from that property, and why they knew so much about me. After the note stopped, I should have felt relieved. For a while, I convinced myself that whoever had been sending them had moved on, but deep down, something still nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Months went by without incident. I got back into my usual routine, but I started keeping pepper spray in my bag and always double checking the locks on my doors and windows. I avoided driving near the farmhouse or even thinking about it, until one day I got curious. I don't know what compelled me to search for it again. Maybe it was the unsettling feeling of unfinished business. Maybe it was my own stubborn curiosity. Whatever it was, I found myself pulling the old listing out of the archives one quiet afternoon when my boss was out. The property had been sold to a private buyer shortly after we had turned it down. The buyer's name was redacted in the records, marked only as anonymous. The sale price was shockingly low, even for a foreclosed property in disrepair. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. It was the note in the file. Property sold as is, no inspections permitted. Buyer advised of local legend. That stopped me cold. I hadn't heard of any stories connected to the farmhouse. I did some digging online, trying to figure out what that meant. Most of what I found were vague mentions in old town forums, references to strange lights seen near the property at night, animals going missing in the area, or trespassers claiming to hear whispers when no one was around. And then I stumbled upon something chilling. A blog post written by a former resident of the area described the farmhouse as cursed. According to the writer, anyone who tried to renovate or live on the property would either disappear or leave town suddenly, claiming they couldn't handle it anymore. The most recent attempt had been about 10 years ago, when a couple bought the house intending to flip it. They vanished without a trace. Their car was found a mile away, abandoned and locked. I felt a cold sweat run down my back as I read. That's when I remembered something. The third note, the one left on my car windshield. The handwriting was shaky, but there had been a faint, smudged mark beneath the signature, a tiny circle with a slash through it. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it reminded me of something I'd seen in the blog post. An old symbol locals claimed was meant to ward off whatever lurked at the farmhouse. I wanted to tell myself it was all coincidence, but it felt like too much. That night, I dreamt of the farmhouse. In the dream, I stood at the edge of the overgrown driveway, staring at its dark, broken windows. Something moved inside, a shadow flitted past, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I woke up gasping for air. The next morning, I told myself I'd drop it. No more research, no more dwelling on the farmhouse. But as I drove to work, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A bright pink envelope taped to the front door of the real estate office. I didn't want to open it. My hands were shaking as I carefully peeled it off the door and unfolded the note inside. "We told you to stop. I quit my job the next day." I didn't tell my boss about the note or the farmhouse or anything else. I just left. I moved to another town a few months later, leaving no forwarding address. To this day, I've never gone back to that area or looked up the farmhouse again. Even after moving away, I couldn't escape the lingering paranoia. I started to notice small things that didn't sit right. My mail would occasionally arrive late or appear tampered with, and I'd spot unfamiliar cars parked near my new apartment building at odd hours. At first, I brushed it off as anxiety, but then one evening evening, something happened that confirmed my fears. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a soft tapping sound at my window. I lived on the second floor, so it couldn't have been a stray branch or an animal. My heart raced as I froze, unsure whether I should look or stay out of sight. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. There was nothing there. No person, no shadow, just the dim glow of the streetlights and the empty parking lot below. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but when I returned to the couch, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an airdrop request. I didn't recognize the sender, and my stomach dropped as I read the file name, Liceo. I declined the request immediately and turned off my phone's Bluetooth. My hands were shaking as I scrambled to check the locks on all the doors and windows. I stayed awake all night, staring at the curtains, jumping at every creak or distant sound. The next morning, I decided it was time to go to the police. I brought everything with me, the pink notes, the blog post I'd printed, even a photo of the airdrop notification. The officer at the desk listened patiently, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. "You moved out of state," he said. "It's unlikely anyone's following you. This might just be a prank." I left the station feeling more isolated than ever. If the police weren't going to help, what was I supposed to do? I thought about moving again, but I couldn't afford it. Instead, I bought a security camera and installed it outside my apartment. For a few weeks, things seemed quiet. The tapping stopped, the strange cars disappeared, and I started to feel like maybe I'd imagined the worst of it. But then, one morning, I woke up to find a single sheet of paper slipped under my door. It was folded neatly, just like the notes before. I didn't want to open it, but I forced myself to. This one was different. It was typed, not handwritten, and the message was brief. "You shouldn't have moved. You can't outrun this." I checked the security camera footage immediately. The timestamp showed someone in a dark hoodie crouching outside my door at 3:42 a.m. They moved quickly, slipping the paper under the door and disappearing down the hall before I could make out any features. That was my breaking point. I packed up my things and left that same day, moving to a motel in another town. I told my landlord I had a family emergency and couldn't stay. I didn't even tell my friends where I went. It's been over a year since then. I've changed my phone number, stayed off social media, and moved 3 more times. The notes haven't returned, but the fear lingers. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, sends my heart racing. Whatever was tied to that farmhouse didn't want me to leave it alone. And even though I've done everything I could to disappear, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting for me to slip up. About a year ago, I rented a small art studio in an old brick building downtown. It had high ceilings, tall windows that let in shafts of sunlight during the day, and a faint smell of turpentine and dust. The building had been repurposed from an old textile factory and now housed a mix of artists, writers, and the occasional eccentric hobbyist. It was perfect, or so I thought. I mostly worked in the evenings, painting portraits for a local gallery. My studio was at the end of a long hallway on the 3rd floor. The other studios on my floor were rarely occupied at night, so it was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. One night, I was packing up around midnight when I noticed something odd. Across the hall, there was a studio with frosted glass doors. Through the glass, I could see the silhouette of a mannequin. Its shape was strange, more angular and sharp than any mannequin I'd seen before. It hadn't been there earlier in the day. Curious but not overly concerned, I left for the night. The next evening, the mannequin was still there. This time, it seemed closer to the door. I tried to peer through the frosted glass to see more detail, but the lights in that studio were off, and the frosted glass only blurred the shape further. By the 3rd night, the mannequin's position had changed again. It now seemed to be facing the door, as if it were staring directly at me through the glass. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I decided to ask the building manager about it. She looked at me confused. "No one's rented that studio in months," she said. I laughed nervously, assuming she was mistaken. "Maybe someone's storing their things there." She shook her head. "I have the only key." The next night, I couldn't resist checking. I brought a flashlight and approached the studio door. My heart was pounding as I peered through the glass again. The mannequin was gone. I felt a wave of relief until I turned around. It was standing in the hallway, mere feet from me. I didn't hear it move. I didn't hear anything at all. Frozen, I stared at it. Its face was blank, its body unnaturally contorted, and its surface had an almost wet sheen, like it was sweating. I bolted. The next day, I went back to the building manager and demanded answers. She reluctantly gave me the key to the studio, probably just to shut me up. I opened the door to find nothing but an empty room, no mannequin, no sign that anyone had been there. The following weeks were a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the image of the mannequin from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it there in the hallway, its blank, wet face tilted slightly as if studying me. I convinced myself I was just overtired, that the long hours and isolation of painting had played tricks on my mind. But then, things started happening at home. The first incident was subtle, a faint knocking sound at my apartment door late at night. I lived on the 3rd floor of a secure building, and no one I knew would visit unannounced at such an hour. Peering through the peephole revealed nothing but an empty hallway. Still, the sound persisted every few nights, always around 2 a.m. Then I began noticing small objects in my apartment move from where I'd left them. A brush left on my desk would appear on the floor. A mug from the kitchen counter would end up in the sink. At first, I thought I was just forgetful, distracted, but as it kept happening, I knew it wasn't me. One night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold, the creak of my bedroom door opening. My heart raced as I stared into the darkness. The door slowly swung inward, revealing nothing. I turned on the light, trembling, but my room was empty. I barely slept after that. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my essentials and crashed at a friend's place, determined to break whatever curse I seemed to have stumbled into. I didn't tell her about the mannequin or the studio. I didn't want to sound crazy. After a week at her place, things seemed to settle. The knocking stopped, and nothing strange happened. I started to think maybe I had left whatever was haunting me behind in that studio. Until one night, when I returned to her apartment after work, her place was small, and she always kept the front window blinds open for light. From the street below, I could see the living room, lit and empty, except for a figure standing in the corner. The mannequin, its angular body was silhouetted against the light, perfectly still, facing the window. I froze, the grocery bags in my hands falling to the pavement. When I looked again, it was gone. I never went back inside. I called my friend from the street and told her to leave immediately. She thought I was insane, but thankfully she listened. She never saw the mannequin, and to this day, she insists I must have imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I moved far away after that, to a new city and a new state, and I've been careful never to work late or stay anywhere alone. It's been months now, and I haven't seen it since. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as though something is watching me. Life slowly began to settle after I moved. I chose a place in a bustling city where the noise and activity gave me a sense of safety. My new apartment was small but cozy, perched on the 6th floor of a well-maintained building. I avoided working late nights, spent more time around people, and made an effort to stay grounded. I convinced myself that whatever the mannequin was, if it was even real, it wouldn't find me here. For months, things were normal, peaceful, even until the package arrived. It was a plain brown box with no return address. At first, I thought it was something I'd ordered and forgotten about. The handwriting on the label was neat but unfamiliar. The delivery had been left on my doorstep, and curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single item, an old, cracked mirror. The glass was cloudy, and the frame looked handmade, roughly carved wood with faded paint that might have once been white. As I pulled it from the box, I noticed something strange. The glass wasn't reflecting properly. My face appeared distorted, stretched in odd angles, like a funhouse mirror. Unease crept over me as I realized the mirror's surface felt unnaturally cold, even in my warm apartment. I decided not to keep it. I wrapped it back up, placed it in the hallway outside my apartment, and planned to drop it off at a donation center the next day. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the feeling that something wasn't right. When I opened my door the next morning, the box was gone. For a moment, I felt relief, maybe someone had taken it, but then I turned back into my apartment and froze. The mirror was sitting on my kitchen table. I knew I hadn't brought it back inside. The door had been locked, and there were no signs of a break-in. My stomach churned as I realized the mirror wasn't just back, it looked different. The cracks in the glass seemed more pronounced, forming jagged lines that almost resembled a face. I threw the mirror out that day. I didn't care where it ended up as long as it was out of my home. I left it in a dumpster several blocks away and returned to my apartment, feeling a mix of triumph and paranoia. But that night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood freeze, a faint tapping coming from my closet. My heart raced as I reached for my phone, its light barely illuminating the room. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I wanted to believe it was something mundane, a pipe perhaps, but deep down, I knew better. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept to the closet and threw the door open. It was empty, no mirror, no mannequins, nothing. The tapping stopped instantly, leaving me in silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting with every light in the apartment turned on. The next day, I called a locksmith and had the locks changed. I considered moving again but decided to wait, hoping it was just my imagination. A week passed without incident. Then, one evening, as I was coming home from work, I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting in front of my apartment door was the mirror, its frame cracked in places that hadn't been there before. The distorted, almost human shape in the glass was clearer now, and as I stared, I thought thought I saw it move. I'm writing this now from a motel room across town. I've left my apartment for good, breaking the lease and abandoning everything I owned. It doesn't feel like enough. I don't think it matters where I go. Whatever this is, it's found me. I can't escape it. I used to live in a big city known for its sprawling urban skyline. My apartment was on the 14th floor of a towery residential complex. From my living room window, I could see a neighboring building's flat rooftop. It was one of those older buildings with a large, empty expanse of tar paper and gravel, dotted with rusty ventilation fans and a long dormant water tower. One summer evening, during one of those humid, restless nights, I was sitting by my window, sipping on a cold drink and enjoying the faint breeze. The rooftop was dark except for a single, flickering light. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes maintenance crews would leave work lights out. I didn't think much of it until the light moved. It wasn't a steady movement like someone walking with a flashlight. It wobbled like a lantern swaying in the wind. I squinted at the distance, trying to make out more details, but the light wasn't bright enough to illuminate anything around it. Just as I was about to dismiss it as nothing, a shape passed through the light. It was faint, almost translucent, but definitely there. It was tall and gangly, with impossibly long arms and a slight hunch to its back. The lantern dangled from one of its hands, or what I assumed was a hand. It paused mid-step, turning as though it was looking straight at me. I froze. I knew it couldn't really see me, not from that distance. My apartment was dark, and I was behind thick glass. Still, the way it lingered felt deliberate, as though it had sensed something. Suddenly, the light disappeared, plunging the rooftop back into darkness. For a moment, I thought it had gone, but then I noticed movement again, a faint shadow darting across the rooftop, impossibly fast and fluid. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. My rational brain told me to calm down, that it was just a trick of the light or maybe a bird flying across the roof. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Still, I couldn't resist looking out the window at the rooftop. It was empty as I'd expected, no light, no strange shadows, just the same worn gravel and tar paper. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the rooftop, directly across from my window, was a pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle. I hadn't seen that the night before. That night, I closed my blinds. I haven't opened them since. For a while after that, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. I didn't mention it to anyone who would believe me. A lantern carrying shadow on a rooftop. It sounded ridiculous even to me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. A few nights later, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a faint tapping sound. It wasn't coming from the door, but from the window. My blood ran cold. I hadn't opened the blind since that night. Slowly, I crept toward the window, holding my breath. The tapping grew louder and more deliberate, like someone gently knocking with a fingernail. I stood there, frozen, staring at the closed blinds. My phone was on the counter, out of reach. I wanted to pull the cord and look, to prove to myself it was nothing, just a branch blowing in the wind, or maybe a bird. But deep down, I knew better. I backed away, step by step, until I was in the hallway. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It stretched on for what felt like hours, and just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, I heard something new, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across glass. This time, I grabbed my phone and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I stayed there for the rest of the night, the lights on, scrolling mindlessly through social media to distract myself. I didn't sleep a wink. When dawn finally broke, I emerged cautiously. The apartment was quiet, the blinds undisturbed. I convinced myself it was over, whatever it was. But my relief was short-lived. That evening, as the sun set, I noticed something out of place. On my balcony table sat a small, rusted lantern. I hadn't placed it there. I didn't even own a lantern. It looked old, the kind you'd see in a historical reenactment or an antique store. Its glass was cracked, and inside was a melted down candle that had long since burned out. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go out on the balcony. I just stared at it, heart pounding, trying to piece together how it had gotten there. My building was high security. No one could have climbed up to my balcony. No one had access but me. That night, I slept with all the lights on and my phone clutched in my hand. The lantern remained on the balcony, a silent reminder of whatever I had seen, or whatever had seen me. The next morning, it was gone. I moved out a month later. The lease was almost up anyway, and I couldn't stand being in that apartment any longer. To this day, I don't know what happened. I never saw the lantern or the shadow again, but I still think about that rooftop. Was it a warning, a message, or just a random encounter with something I'll never understand? Moving out helped, but only slightly. Even after I settled into a new apartment miles away from the old one, the experience lingered. Every time I walked past a window at night, I'd catch myself glancing outside, half expecting to see that flickering lantern. Rationally, Rationally, I knew it couldn't have followed me, but irrational fears don't care about logic. About 3 months after I moved, I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. It wasn't unusual. I'd been updating my address on accounts and utilities, so I assumed it was some leftover paperwork. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It showed the rooftop of my old building. The photo wasn't well framed. It was slightly tilted and grainy, as though it had been taken quickly, but I could see the circle of stones, now surrounded by strange symbols scrawled in white chalk. I didn't recognize the symbols, but they had an eerie, purposeful look, like something out of a ritual. My first instinct was to throw the photo away, but I couldn't stop staring at it. There, near the edge of the rooftop, was a faint shape. It was blurry, almost transparent, but it was there, the same gangly, hunched figure I had seen that first night. The lantern it held was glowing faintly in the dim light of the photo. I flipped the Polaroid over, hoping for some kind of explanation. Instead, there were just 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Still watching, careful." I dropped the photo like it was on fire. My hand shook as I stared at it lying on the table, the words practically burning into my brain. Who had sent this? How did they know where I lived? More importantly, what did they mean by careful? I called the police. They took the photo and the envelope, promising to look into it, but I could tell from the way they talked that they thought it was just a prank. Maybe it was. That would have been the best case scenario, but deep down, I didn't believe it. For weeks, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself that the whole ordeal was over. Then, one night, I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from my closet. The tapping was faint, almost tentative, like someone was gently knocking from inside. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I got out of bed and crossed the room, every step feeling like it took hours. I opened the closet door in one quick motion, bracing for something, anything, but it was empty, just my clothes and a few boxes. I shone the flashlight around, my breathing ragged, nothing, but then I noticed it, a faint, lingering smell like burnt wax and metal. My blood ran cold. It smelled exactly like an old, extinguished lantern. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, I called a movie company. I didn't care how ridiculous it looked. I packed up and left that same day. I didn't tell my landlord why, and I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just wanted out. Now, years later, I still don't know what that thing was or why it fixated on me. I've moved twice since then, never staying in one place for too long. I keep my windows covered, my doors locked, and my phone within arm's reach at all times. This happened to be last summer when I worked part-time at a small community pool. The pool wasn't much, just a couple of lanes for laps, a shallow kiddie section, and a tiny concession stand that sold overpriced nachos and soda. But the place had a reputation for being haunted. The older lifeguards would joke about it, claiming to hear voices echoing when the pool was empty or seeing ripples in the water at night. I didn't believe them, at least not until the 4th stall incident. The locker rooms were pretty run down. There were 3 showers and 4 stalls in the women's bathroom. Everyone avoided the 4th stall because the lock was broken and the door always swung open on its own. It was this rusty, creaky thing that never fully shut, no matter how much you fiddled with it. One day, I was on closing duty. That meant making sure the locker rooms were cleaned, the trash was taken out, and everything was locked up. It was around 9:30 p.m. and I was the last person in the building. I was sweeping up the women's locker room when I noticed the door to the 4th stall was shut. Fully shut. This struck me as odd because I had just been in there 5 minutes earlier and the door had been wide open as usual. Hello, I called, thinking maybe one of the lifeguards had come back to grab something they forgot. No answer. I knocked lightly on the stall door. Still no response. Feeling a little uneasy, I crouched down to see if there were any feet underneath. There weren't. At this point, I was starting to feel creeped out. I tapped the door with my broom handle and it creaked open, slow and loud. The stall was empty, of course, but the air inside felt wrong. It was cooler than the rest of the room and had this faint, metallic smell like old pennies. I told myself I was imagining things, quickly finished sweeping, and got out of there. The next day, I mentioned it to one of the older lifeguards, Sarah. Her face went pale. Wait, you don't know about the 4th stall? She asked. No what? Apparently, a few years back, a girl drowned in the pool during a birthday party. No one noticed right away because the party was so chaotic. They found her too late, and she didn't make it. Her friends had said she went to the locker room just before it happened to use the bathroom. Specifically, the 4th stall. I tried to laugh it off, but Sarah was dead serious. We don't talk about it it because her parents still come here sometimes, she said, but weird stuff happens. I'm telling you. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I avoided the fourth stall as much as possible, even during cleaning. But about a week later, I was closing up again when I heard it, a faint knocking sound coming from the locker room. When I went inside, I saw the door to the fourth stall swinging back and forth, like someone had just pushed it. I froze, broom in hand. For a split second, I thought I heard a giggle, not loud, but light and far away, like it was coming from the air itself. I didn't finish cleaning that night. I locked up and ran to my car as fast as I could. After quitting, I tried to move on. I got a new job at a bookstore, something quieter, with no creepy locker rooms or haunted stalls. For a while, things seemed fine. The memories of the fourth stall faded into the background, almost like a bad dream. But then something happened that made me question if I had really left it behind. One night, I was closing up at the bookstore. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the store was dead silent. I was shelving some returns in the back corner when I heard it, the same faint, rhythmic knocking sound. My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was the heating system or maybe something outside, but as I stood there, holding my breath, I realized it was coming from the restroom area at the back of the store. I hadn't been back there all night. Against my better judgment, I went to investigate. The restroom door was propped open, as it always was after closing. The sound was louder now, unmistakable. I stepped inside and saw the stall door at the far end, fourth in a row, slowly swinging back and forth. Just like at the pool. Nope, I whispered to myself, backing out. But before I could turn around, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I bolted out of the restroom, heart hammering, and called my manager to tell him I was locking up early. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept telling myself it was a coincidence, that I was just paranoid because of what happened at the pool. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The knocking started at my apartment a week later. It was faint at first, barely audible, but always in sets of 4. Sometimes it came from my closet, other times from the bathroom. One night, I even heard it from under my bed. No matter how loud I turned up the TV or how much I distracted myself, it always came back. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of giggling, soft, airy, and far too close. My bedroom door, which I always kept shut, was wide open, and on the floor, just inside the doorway, was a faint, wet footprint. That was the final straw. I packed a bag and left that apartment the next day, staying with a friend for a while. Eventually, I moved to a new city entirely, desperate to escape whatever had attached itself to me. It's been a year now, and for the most part, things have been quiet. But every so often, I'll hear a faint knock, 4 beats, soft and rhythmic. I'll tell myself it's just a creaky pipe or a noisy neighbor. But deep down, I know it's not. Moving to a new city brought me some peace, at least for a while. I avoided public restrooms, locker rooms, or anywhere with multiple stalls. Even at home, I started leaving doors open, closet doors, bathroom doors, just so I wouldn't have to deal with them closing on their own. It helped calm my nerves, but the fear never fully went away. One night, I was out with a small group of coworkers. We'd gone to a bar near work to celebrate someone's promotion. It was loud, crowded, and bright, the perfect kind of place to keep my mind off everything. But then, I made a mistake. After 2 drinks, I needed to use the restroom. It was a single occupancy one, nothing like the rows of stalls that haunted me before. I told myself it was fine, that I was overreacting. I pushed open the door, locked it behind me, and tried to focus on calming my nerves. As I washed my hands, I noticed something strange. The mirror above the sink was old and spotted, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But in the corner of the glass, just at the edge of the reflection, I saw movement. I froze. There was no one else in the restroom. I'd locked the door behind me. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the movement was gone. Then I heard it, faint and muffled but unmistakable, the sound of knocking. 4 soft taps, coming from the other side of the wall. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just noise from the crowded bar. But as I dried my hands and reached for the door, I heard the giggle, light and airy, like a child trying to stifle a laugh. I didn't look back. I yanked the door open and bolted out of the restroom, not caring who saw me. My coworkers stared as I rushed back to the table, pale and shaking. Someone asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and said I wasn't feeling well. When I got home that night, I checked every lock, every window, and every corner of my apartment. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of dread wouldn't go away. I stayed up all night, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed answers. I contacted Sarah, the lifeguard from the pool, hoping she might know something more. She was surprised to hear from me, but when I explained everything, she hesitated before speaking. "You need to talk to someone," she said, "someone who knows how to deal with this kind of thing." I wasn't sure what she meant until she gave me the number of a woman who claimed to be a medium. I was skeptical, but desperation has a way of changing your perspective. The medium, an older woman named Diane, friend came to my apartment a few days later. She walked through the room slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she reached the bathroom, she stopped. "You've been marked," she said softly. "Marked?" I asked, my stomach twisting. It's not uncommon when spirits attach themselves to people. They're drawn to fear, to unresolved energy. But this one is different. It's playful, but it's not harmless. I felt my knees go weak. What do I do? Dia gave me a long look before answering. "You need to confront it, acknowledge it, tell it that it doesn't have power over you. But be firm. Spirits like this thrive on attention, and the more you feed it, the stronger it becomes." The thought of confronting whatever this was terrified me, but I didn't see another option. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, every light on, and said aloud, "I know you're here. I don't know what you want, but you're not welcome. You don't belong here, and I'm not afraid of you." The knocking stopped after that. The apartment felt lighter, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night. I was helping a professor digitize a collection of rare manuscripts for a research project. The building housing the manuscripts was old, tucked away at the farthest corner of the campus. It was the kind of place that even students seemed to avoid: creaky wooden floors, dim lighting, and a musty smell that clung to the walls. The professor showed me the ropes on my first day, and then I was left to work on my own for the rest of the week. My job was straightforward: scan, catalog, and upload the files. The room I worked in was on the 3rd floor, a long, narrow space lined with shelves of books and boxes that probably hadn't been touched in decades. On the second day, I noticed something odd. Every time I left the room to use the restroom or grab coffee, one of the chairs would be slightly moved when I returned. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The shifts were subtle, a chair angled differently or pulled just a bit away from the table. By the 3rd day, it was undeniable. I decided to test it. Before leaving for lunch, I placed a stack of books on the seat of the chair and took a photo with my phone. When I returned, the books were still there, but the chair had been pushed all the way under the table. I asked the professor about it, trying to sound casual. He laughed and said, "Oh, that's just the custodian. He's been here forever. Quiet guy, keeps to himself." That night, I stayed late to finish a batch of manuscripts. Around 9 p.m., the building was silent except for the faint hum of the scanner. I heard a creak behind me and turned, expecting to see the custodian. The aisle was empty. I brushed it off and kept working, but the feeling of being watched crept in. The overhead lights flickered, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I decided I'd had enough and packed up to leave. As I locked the door to the room, I glanced down the hall and froze. At the end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of the dim light, stood a figure. They were motionless, their silhouette barely distinguishable. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing in the empty building. No response. I didn't stick around to investigate. I practically ran down the stairs and out into the cold night air. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to the professor. His face turned serious. "There's no custodian on staff," he said slowly. I insisted that someone had been moving the chair, and I described the figure in the hall. He shook his head. "You're the only one with access to that floor." After my experience, I tried to push the incident to the back of my mind. I told myself it was just exhaustion and overthinking from working late in a creepy old building. But the encounter nagged at me, the details refusing to fade. About a week later, I got a package in the mail. It was from the university professor. Inside was a small envelope and a letter. The letter read, "Thank you for your help with the manuscripts. I thought you might find this interesting. I was reviewing the digitized files and found a note tucked inside one of the books you scanned. It doesn't appear to match the age or context of the manuscripts. I'd appreciate your thoughts." Curious, I opened the envelope. The note inside was written on old, yellow paper in shaky, spidery handwriting. It said, "You should be here. Leave before he notices you." My stomach dropped. I recognized the book the note had come from. It was one of the last ones I worked on before leaving that night. I hadn't noticed anything strange about it at the time, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that the warning was meant for me. I immediately called the professor. He sounded uneasy when he answered, and I could hear the slight tremor in his voice as he said, "There's something else. Since you left, I've been working in the archive alone, and I've started noticing things." He described the same phenomena I had experienced: the moved chairs, the flickering lights, the feeling of being watched. Then he added something new. "Last night, I heard footsteps on the 3rd floor. They were slow, deliberate. I thought maybe it was you or someone from the staff, but when I went to check, the hall was empty." The footsteps continued, though, right above me, moving back and forth, like they were pacing. I didn't know what to say. The idea of someone or something still moving through that building made my skin crawl. "Have you told anyone else?" I asked. I brought it up to one of the admin staff. He said, "She told me the building was supposed to be decommissioned decades ago, but they kept it open because of the archive." She also said there were rumors about a staff member who disappeared there years ago, a custodian who was said to know every inch of the building but was never found. That was enough for me. I told the professor I wanted nothing more to do with the project, and he didn't try to convince me otherwise. months. He said he'd wrap it up and suggested I focus on other work. I haven't heard from him since. Months went by and life returned to normal, or at least I told myself it had. I avoided thinking about the archive, the note, and the figure, but some part of me was still unsettled, like I was waiting for something to resurface. It wasn't until 6 months later that I finally heard from the professor again. It was an email, brief and cryptic. I think you should know what I found. I'm not sure what to do with it, but I believe you deserve to see it. Please don't ignore this. Attached was a single file. It was a low-resolution video, dated 2 weeks after I had left the project. I hesitated before opening it. The memory of that building and its oppressive silence still clung to me, but curiosity won out. The video began with shaky footage of the archive's third-floor hallway, the same one I had seen the figure standing in that night. The professor's voice came over the audio, unsteady and low. I set up a motion-activated camera to catch whatever's been happening. He said, "This was recorded last night." At first, the hallway was still and silent, lit only by the dim overhead lights. A few seconds passed, and then the camera caught it, a chair sitting at one of the desks, sliding out on its own. The movement was slow but deliberate. The chair stopped as though someone had sat down. Then, nothing. The video cut to another clip, timestamped just an hour later. This time, the motion sensor had picked up a shadow at the far end of the hall. It wasn't a person. It was amorphous, dark, and shifting, like smoke curling in the air. It lingered for several seconds before dissipating into the wall. The final clip was the most disturbing. It showed the professor himself walking down the hall, presumably to check the camera. As he moved, the shadow reappeared behind him. It didn't follow him, though. It stood there, stretching unnaturally tall, as though watching him leave. The video ended abruptly. I stared at the screen, heart racing. I emailed the professor back immediately, asking if he was okay, but my message bounced back. His university email was no longer active. Concerned, I tried calling the department, but the receptionist said the professor had taken an extended leave of absence. She didn't know when or if he'd return. I don't know what happened to him after that. A part of me doesn't want to know. All I do know is that whatever is in that building isn't a custodian, and it isn't bound by the usual rules of this world. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the shadow and its silent, watchful presence. And sometimes, I wonder if leaving that project was enough to escape its notice, or if I might someday find a chair moved in my own home, or a shadow where one should it be. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.